Desire is never simple. It wears many masks, some of longing, others of fear. And so there arises this paradox that one may deeply want you and yet turn away as though you never existed. At first glance, we interpret this as rejection. The ego, wounded by silence, concludes that love is absent, interest is lacking. But such judgments are superficial, for the psyche does not always move in straight lines. It turns inward, conceals defense, and above all, protects the fragile structure of identity. The conflict between conscious will and unconscious fear is one of the most mysterious and powerful dynamics in human psychology. It reveals itself most poignantly in our relationships, particularly when desire is present. A person may feel drawn toward another, even captivated, and yet their behavior may contradict that desire entirely. They may grow distant, ignore the other, or even act cold and indifferent. To the one on the receiving end, this seems irrational or cruel. But from the perspective of the unconscious psyche, it is deeply meaningful. The conscious will may say, I want this person, while the unconscious fear responds, but what might happen if I get too close? This dissonance between intention and behavior is not hypocrisy. It is fragmentation. Every individual carries within them unresolved experiences, memories, and emotional wounds that shape how they relate to others. These wounds are often buried in the unconscious, out of view, but they are not inactive. On the contrary, they are alive and potent, quietly shaping our instincts, reactions, and defense mechanisms. When someone encounters a person who awakens longing within them, particularly deep longing, they are also confronting the psychic material that has been split off and left unintegrated. To desire someone is to activate old associations of love, of loss, of rejection, of abandonment, of unworthiness. The stronger the desire, the more intense the activation. This is why the psyche often defends itself through withdrawal. The act of ignoring someone we want is not a lack of feeling. It is a protection against what those feelings threaten to reveal. For instance, a person who has never truly experienced secure love may find themselves drawn to someone who offers emotional intimacy. And yet, as they approach, the unconscious fear surges. Love begins to resemble danger. Vulnerability evokes memories of being hurt. So rather than leaning in, they retreat, sometimes even in confusion at their own behavior. The conscious self may be unaware of the fear operating behind the scenes. It simply experiences discomfort, anxiety, or a desire to escape, and so it acts accordingly, often without reflection. The will of the ego, which says, I want connection, is not always enough to override the programming of the unconscious, which is rooted in survival, history, and unresolved inner pain. The psyche does not automatically align with our wishes. It follows a deeper rhythm. It resists what it perceives as threat, even when that threat is no longer real, and emotional intimacy, especially the kind that reaches into the soul, is one of the most threatening experiences for a fragmented or wounded psyche. It demands exposure. It requires the dismantling of defenses. It asks for presence, honesty, and surrender. These are things the ego may agree to in theory, but the unconscious has its own view, formed over years, often in the earliest relationships of childhood. If a person grew up in an environment where love was inconsistent, conditional, or absent, their nervous system learned to associate closeness with unpredictability or pain. Even as an adult, such a person may deeply yearn for love. They may feel starved for it. But when it finally appears, when they encounter someone who reflects back warmth or devotion, their body reacts with alarm. The very intimacy they crave becomes a source of anxiety. This anxiety is not logical, and it is not always explainable in words. It is somatic. It arises from the deepest structures of the psyche. It says, this is dangerous. You will be hurt. You will be left. You will not survive. And so The person may disappear, grow cold, or act as though they feel nothing. In truth, they may feel too much. This is the invisible conflict that governs so many of our strange relational patterns. The part of the psyche that wants connection is in direct opposition with the part that fears annihilation. And the greater the intensity of the desire, the more fiercely the fear will resist it. This is why we often sabotage the very relationships that mean the most to us. It is not because we are ungrateful or cruel. It is because the unconscious is trying to preserve what it perceives as psychic survival. The closer we come to being seen, the closer we are to being hurt. The more we desire someone, the more we fear their absence. So the mind begins to calculate. If I withdraw first, if I ignore them, if I create distance, I will not have to face the terror of being abandoned later. I will have controlled the outcome, even if it means suffering now. There is a strange comfort in being the one who pulls away. It spares the psyche from the rawness of hope. Yet none of this may be visible to the person themselves. They may tell themselves they lost interest, that it wasn't the right time, that the feeling wasn't mutual, but underneath these rationalizations lies a psychic wound that has not yet been integrated. The conflict is between the desire to move forward and the compulsion to remain safe. In psychological terms, this is the clash between individuation, the process of becoming whole, and the inertia of the old self, the one that survived through avoidance and control. When someone ignores a person they are drawn to, it is often an act of unconscious self-protection, not a calculated game, not emotional manipulation, but an instinctive recall. The person they are drawn to represents more than just a romantic possibility. They represent a confrontation with the self, with long buried pain, with the possibility of healing, but also the terror of that healing process. For healing is not gentle. It dissolves identities, calls into question old defenses, and breaks open what was hidden. The unconscious knows this, and so it hesitates, resists, distracts, or retreats. The desire remains, but it is held at a distance, like a flame admired from afar but never touched. This inner conflict is universal. It shows up not only in love, but in creativity, vocation, and transformation of all kinds. Whenever we approach something we deeply long for, we awaken the guardians of the past, those inner figures who remind us of failure, fear, and fragility. These guardians are not our enemies. They are fragments of our psyche that once kept us safe, but they are also what keep us small. To move beyond them requires not brute force, but deep awareness. One must come into a relationship with the fear, not repress it, not run from it, but see it, name it, and begin to integrate it. Until the work is done, until the unconscious material is brought into consciousness, the pattern will persist. The person may continue to ignore those they desire, to run from connection, to repeat cycles of withdrawal. It is not a curse, but a signal, a call to examine the deeper layers of the self. For only by understanding the fear can one release its grip. Only by facing the shadow can the individual move toward wholeness and allow themselves to receive what they most deeply long for. Projection is one of the most potent and misunderstood forces in human relationships. It occurs when an individual unconsciously attributes their own internal qualities, whether idealized or feared, onto another person. In the context of desire and longing, projection becomes especially powerful because romantic attraction tends to stir the deepest, often unacknowledged parts of the psyche. When someone finds themselves intensely drawn to another, what they are often responding to is not just the external qualities of the person, but the symbolic image they've placed upon them. This image is composed of memories, unmet needs, buried emotions, and unfulfilled fantasies that have been stored in the unconscious. The person becomes a screen, a mirror, onto which this psychological material is cast. When someone is ignored despite being desired, projection frequently plays a key role. The one doing the ignoring may not fully understand what the other represents to them. On a conscious level, they may feel attraction, interest, even admiration, but beneath the surface, the other person becomes a vessel for something more, their idea of love, their fear of abandonment, the archetype of the unattainable, or even the echo of a parent who was never fully present. Because projection is unconscious, the person may not realize the emotional weight they are assigning to the object of their desire. The more intense the projection, the more overwhelming the experience becomes. What begins as attraction quickly turns into inner chaos, and in response to this overload, the person distances themselves, suppresses their desire, and begins to ignore the other. This retreat is not about disinterest. It is about preservation. The unconscious, upon seeing that the projection has become too large, intervenes. It signals danger. Not because the other person has done anything harmful, but because the emotional stakes have become too high. The projection threatens to collapse under its own weight. If the person were to move closer, they might have to confront the dissonance between their fantasy and reality, and that confrontation is painful. For to see the other as they truly are, rather than as the image one has placed upon them, is to recognize that no external person can carry the totality of our longing. The other cannot complete us. They cannot resolve the wounds of our past. They cannot permanently fulfill the emotional hunger we have carried for years. This realization is often too much to bear. So the unconscious finds a way out. It turns the desire into fear, the longing into avoidance. The one being projected onto her often feels a shift. Without understanding, they may sense that they are being seen through a distorted lens. They may feel both elevated and dehumanized. At first they are adored, idealized, or intensely pursued, but as time goes on, the energy shifts. The person who once leaned in begins to pull away. This reversal is deeply confusing, especially when no external event has triggered it, but internally the projector is experiencing an unraveling, the image is cracking, and with it the emotional control they believed they had. This process is not inherently malicious. It is a psychological defense. Projection is the mind's way of dealing with content it is not yet ready to own. For example, if someone has deep feelings of unworthiness, they may project onto another the image of someone perfect, whole, and worthy of love. By idealizing the other, they avoid confronting their own feelings of inadequacy. But as the relationship progresses, the projected image begins to fail. The other person reveals their flaws, their humanity, and the projector, rather than integrating this new reality, often withdraws. They ignore, distance, or detach, because to stay would mean facing their own internal contradiction. They would have to reckon with the fact that they created an illusion and that the real person is not the fantasy they imagined. In many cases, projection involves the reactivation of early emotional experiences, especially those connected to caregivers. A person may project the archetype of the nurturing mother or the protective father onto a romantic interest, seeking through them the security they never received as a child. But no partner can fulfill that role perfectly. The failure of the projection triggers the pain that was originally buried. And rather than facing that pain directly, the person may reject or ignore the one they projected onto. It feels safer to walk away than to sit with the disillusionment. Thus, ignoring someone we want becomes a form of psychic avoidance. It allows the projector to retreat without having to feel the full impact of the emotional confrontation. At the root of projection is a lack of inner integration. When a person has not made peace with their inner world, when they have disowned parts of themselves, they are more likely to see those parts in others. This is why desire can be so destabilizing. The other person becomes the embodiment of the parts of the self that have not been claimed. We project our creativity, our joy, our sensuality, our vulnerability, even our darkness. The more estranged we are from these qualities within ourselves, the more strongly we see them in others. And when those projections become unbearable, when the emotional tension rises too high, the psyche pulls back. Ignoring the person becomes a way to regain psychological balance, even if it leads to loss and regret. This mechanism is rarely conscious. Most people do not realize they are projecting. They believe their feelings are entirely about the other person. But if they were to reflect deeply, they would often find that their desire was less about who the person was and more about what that person symbolized to them. The moment a symbol loses its power, the feelings shift, and rather than confronting this inner reality, they disappear, often without explanation, because they themselves are confused about what has changed. They only know that the emotional intensity has become unsustainable. The tragedy of projection is that it prevents authentic connection. As long as we are relating to an image, we are not relating to a person. The more we project, the less we see. And when the projection begins to dissolve, rather than stepping into the real relationship, many people step away. They ignore not out of cruelty, but out of fear. Fear of being seen as they truly are. Fear of seeing the other without illusion. Fear of encountering the disappointment that so often follows when the fantasy fades. To understand this is to move beyond blame. It is to recognize the profound complexity of the human psyche and the unconscious processes that govern so much of our behavior. Projection is not a flaw. It is a natural part of psychological development. But when it remains unconscious, it distorts relationships and creates cycles of closeness and distance, longing and avoidance. Ignoring someone we want is often a symptom of an internal struggle we have not yet named. It is a defense against the collapse of an image that never truly belonged to the other person but to our own fragmented self. In the end, what often appears as indifference or rejection is in truth a reflection of the hidden turmoil within the human psyche. To be ignored by someone who desires you is not always a matter of disinterest. It is often the result of a deep inner conflict where longing collides with fear and projection overwhelms reality. These are not conscious betrayals, but unconscious defenses protecting fragile identities from being dismantled by the intensity of connection. When we understand this, we cease to take it personally. We begin to see that much of what we experience in relationships is not about us, but about what the other is struggling to face within themselves. And with this awareness, we no longer chase illusions, nor do we collapse under silence. We watch with clarity, we love without possession, and we walk away not in bitterness, but in peace, knowing that what is real never hides, and what hides is not yet ready. Thank you for allowing these thoughts to reach you. May you continue to move through life with deep awareness, quiet strength, and a heart that remains open even when others cannot meet you there. Good luck on your journey, and never forget your worth is not determined by the way others respond to your light, but by your unwavering decision to keep shining anyway.